The moment didn't explode. It settled, quietly, sharply, like a blade laid flat on a table where everyone could see it. Josh Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He didn't interrupt. He waited. And in that pause, barely 2 seconds long, The View stopped being a daytime talk show and became something else entirely. Before we go any further, if you love intense cinematic celebrity moments like this, subscribe to Neon Narration right now, hit like, and comment that you're watching. You won't want to miss what unfolds next. The studio lights were warm, almost flattering, the kind designed to soften tension before it ever has a chance to form. The audience had just finished applauding Josh Charles as he took his seat, polite, enthusiastic, familiar. He smiled, that understated smile audiences had trusted for decades. The smile of a man who had survived long arcs, long silences, long careers. Whoopi Goldberg sat across from him, relaxed but alert, a veteran in her own right. Someone who had seen politicians crack, actors unravel, apologies spill out mid-sentence. She wasn't hostile. Not yet. Her posture said control. Her tone said confidence. This was her table. Her show. The conversation began smoothly. Projects, legacy, the slow burn of a career built on restraint rather than spectacle. Josh spoke thoughtfully, his words measured, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The audience nodded along. Everything felt safe. Too safe. Whoopi tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to signal a shift. Not an attack, an invitation. The kind that looks gentle until you realize there's nowhere to step without being seen. You've always played men who hold back, she said, smiling. Men who watch. Men who don't react right away. Some people say that's powerful. Others say it's avoidance. A ripple moved through the audience. Soft murmurs. A few knowing glances. Josh blinked once. Avoidance. The word landed between them, heavy but unspoken in its implications. Avoidance of conflict. Avoidance of accountability. Avoidance of speaking out, about politics, about controversies, about moments where silence had been louder than words. The camera cut to Josh's face. For a split second, the practiced calm faltered. Not panic, not anger, something deeper. Recognition. He inhaled slowly. I think, he began, then stopped. That pause stretched longer than expected. Too long for television. Producers shifted behind the cameras. Whoopi leaned back slightly, arms crossing, not defensively, but observantly. She was giving him space, or testing how he'd use it. Josh finally spoke again, his voice low, steady. I think silence gets confused with fear far too often. The audience reacted instantly. A soft "oh" rippled through the seats. Someone clapped once, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. So you're saying it's a choice? Josh nodded. Always has been. The tension sharpened, not loud, not chaotic, but precise. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. This was something more dangerous. Two people who knew exactly how words echo when spoken on live television. Whoopi leaned forward now. But when you have a platform, she said, her voice firm but controlled, don't you think choosing silence can look like choosing comfort? There it was. The line that turned conversations into confrontations. The line that had unraveled guests before. The audience held its breath. Josh's hands tightened slightly, knuckles whitening for just a moment before relaxing again. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Comfort, he repeated softly, is an interesting word to use when you're talking about restraint. The camera cut to Sunny Hostin, her lips pressed together, eyes fixed on Josh. Joy Behar leaned back, arms folded, sensing the shift. This wasn't a segment anymore. This was a moment. Josh continued, his voice calm, almost gentle. I've spent most of my career being told that if I just spoke louder, reacted faster, picked a side more publicly, I'd be more relevant, more marketable. He glanced briefly at the audience, then back to Whoopi. But I learned early on that reacting isn't the same as responding. Whoopi's smile faded, not entirely, but enough. People might say, she replied, that waiting too long is a response. Josh nodded again. They might. Another pause. This one deliberate. And they might be right, he added. But they'd still be assuming they know why I waited. The audience shifted again. You could feel it now, the alignment, the divide forming quietly in real time. Some faces nodded in agreement. Others frowned, uncertain. Whoopi exhaled through her nose, a half laugh escaping her lips. So you're saying we shouldn't question it? No, Josh said immediately. I'm saying question it all you want. He leaned forward for the first time. Just don't rewrite it. That was the cut. Not loud, not sharp in delivery, but devastating in precision. The audience reacted audibly this time. Gasps, murmurs, scattered applause that grew despite attempts to contain it. Whoopi's expression hardened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. She'd been challenged, cleanly, publicly, without disrespect. But the tension wasn't released. It deepened. "Rewrite how?" she asked. Josh met her gaze without flinching. "When silence gets turned into guilt. When patience gets labeled cowardice. When someone else's timeline becomes the moral standard." The studio felt smaller now. Closer. Every word seemed to press against the walls. Whoopi nodded slowly, eyes still locked on him. "So you feel misjudged?" Josh hesitated. And in that hesitation, something cracked open. "I feel," he said carefully, "that people are more comfortable with noise than with thought." The audience erupted. Not fully, but enough that producers let it roll. This was no longer controlled. This was raw. Whoopi leaned back again, studying him. Not dismissive. Not angry. Curious. Cautious. "And what about responsibility?" she asked quietly. Josh didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had changed, not softer, but heavier. "Responsibility," he said, "is living with the consequences of your choices, including the ones you make privately, including the ones that don't trend." A hush fell over the room. Even the cameras seemed to slow. For the first time, Whoopi didn't jump in. She let the silence sit. Let it stretch. Josh looked down briefly, then back up. "I've spoken to people," he continued, off camera. "I've shown up where no one was filming. I've chosen conversations that don't reward me." He paused, swallowing. "And I'm okay if that disappoints people who wanted a performance." That word, performance, hung in the air like smoke. The audience was fully engaged now. This wasn't a celebrity defending a PR choice. This was a man drawing a line around his integrity, quietly daring anyone to step over it. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice lower than before. "You. No people will debate this." Josh smiled faintly. "They already are." The camera cut to the audience again. Faces lit with intensity, some conflicted, some inspired, some unsure what they were witnessing. Because this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning unfolding in real time. And the most unsettling part? Josh Charles hadn't raised his voice once. As the segment edged forward, the air thick with unspoken challenges and unresolved questions, one thing was clear. The calm response hadn't ended the conversation. It had only sharpened it. And what came next would push this moment far beyond the studio walls. The applause faded unevenly, like rain hitting different surfaces, some claps strong and deliberate, others hesitant, unsure whether celebration was appropriate in a moment that felt more like a confession than a victory. The cameras kept rolling. They always did. But something had shifted behind the glass lenses. An awareness that whatever had just begun couldn't be neatly wrapped before the commercial break. Whoopi adjusted the papers on the table in front of her, a subtle reset. Her body language said she was back in control, but her eyes told a different story. They stayed on Josh, searching, recalibrating. She wasn't offended. She was engaged. And that made this far more dangerous. "You know," she said slowly, "when people come on this show, they don't just speak for themselves. They speak to people watching who don't have access, who don't have platforms. Silence from someone like you can feel distant." Josh listened without interruption, nodding slightly. He didn't rush to defend himself this time. That alone made the room lean toward him. The audience sensed it. The restraint, the refusal to turn this into a back-and-forth soundbite war. "I understand that," he replied, "and I don't dismiss it." He paused, then added, "But distance isn't always neglect. Sometimes it's perspective." Sunny leaned in now, unable to stay out of it. "But perspective can look like privilege," she said, her voice precise, measured like a closing argument. "Especially when the consequences don't land on you." The audience murmured again, louder this time. This was the tension they were used to. This was familiar territory, accountability, privilege, expectation. Josh had stepped directly into it, and there was no retreating without consequence. Josh turned toward Sunny, his expression respectful but unyielding. "You're right," he said. "It can look like that." He took a breath, a deeper one than before. "But I don't think it's fair to assume that visibility equals virtue, or that volume equals impact." Whoopi interjected gently, "But people measure what they can see." Josh nodded. "And that's the problem." That landed heavier than the last line. The audience quieted, sensing the direction this was going. This wasn't about one interview anymore. This was about culture, about the demand to perform morality publicly, on cue, or be labeled complicit. Josh continued, his voice steady but layered now with something rawer beneath the calm. We've created a system where speaking fast matters more than speaking truthfully, where reacting publicly matters more than acting privately. Joy Behar let out a short, skeptical laugh. So what, you're above it? Josh turned to her, eyes sharp but not hostile. No, he said. I'm responsible to it, just not obedient to it. That drew a louder reaction, applause this time, more confident. A few audience members nodded emphatically. Others crossed their arms. The divide was no longer subtle. Whoopi held up a hand slightly, signaling calm, but her tone carried weight. You have to understand, she said. For some people, hearing nothing from someone they admire feels like abandonment. Josh's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. This wasn't an abstract argument for him. It was personal now. I do understand, he said quietly, and I've wrestled with that more than you know. The room leaned in. Even the hosts seemed to sense it. This was the edge of something deeper. There were moments, Josh continued, when I almost spoke just to stop the questions, just to satisfy the noise. He shook his head slightly. But every time, I asked myself, am I doing this to help, or to be seen helping? The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. The kind that television producers hate and audiences never forget. Sonny broke it. And what if people needed you to be seen? Josh looked at her, then at Whoopi, then briefly at the audience. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but it carried. Then I failed them, he said. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, wow. Josh didn't stop. But I would rather fail honestly than succeed performatively. That was it. That was the line that tipped the room. Applause broke out, stronger now, sustained, layered with emotion. Some stood. Others stayed seated, conflicted. The camera caught Whoopi's face as she absorbed it. Not defensive, not triumphant. Thoughtful. She waited for the applause to die down before speaking again. You know people are going to take this personally, she said. Josh nodded. They already have. And you're okay with that? Josh exhaled slowly. I'm not comfortable with it, he admitted. But I'm at peace with it. That distinction mattered. You could feel it land. The conversation pivoted then, subtly but decisively. It wasn't about whether Josh Charles had spoken enough, fast enough, loudly enough. It was about whether the culture watching him was willing to sit with discomfort instead of demanding reassurance. Whoopi leaned back, folding her hands. I don't agree with everything you're saying, she said plainly. Josh smiled faintly. I didn't expect you to. But, she continued, I respect that you're saying it without hiding. Josh met her gaze. That means more than agreement. The audience applauded again, not explosive but warm, earned. Yet beneath the surface, tension still simmered. Social media was already lighting up. Phones vibrated in pockets. Producers whispered updates off camera. This moment wasn't staying in the studio. It was escaping, being clipped, captioned, debated in real time. And Josh seemed to know it. He glanced briefly toward the camera, not breaking the fourth wall, but acknowledging its presence. The watchers beyond the room. I know this won't satisfy everyone, he said, but I hope it makes people think before they demand a performance from someone who's still figuring things out. Whoopi nodded slowly. Fair, but her eyes suggested the conversation wasn't over. Not here, not now, because when you challenge the expectation to perform morality on command, you don't just start a discussion, you expose a fault line. And as the show edged toward its next break, with smiles returning and voices softening, one had deepened into something far more unsettling. The real confrontation wasn't between Josh Charles and Whoopi Goldberg anymore. It was between the audience and itself. And what followed would make this moment impossible to ignore. The commercial break came and went, but the tension didn't reset. If anything, it matured, settling into the studio like a low hum beneath the lights. The applause that welcomed them back was polite, restrained, as if the audience sensed they were stepping back into unfinished business. Josh adjusted slightly in his chair. Not nervous, grounded. The kind of stillness that comes when someone has already accepted the consequences of what they've said. Whoopi returned her gaze to him with a measured calm that only comes from decades in the spotlight. We're back, she said to the camera, then turned to Josh again. Before the break, you said something that stuck with people in this room. She paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle. You said you'd rather fail honestly than succeed performatively. The audience reacted immediately, soft murmurs, nods, a few quiet claps. Whoopi continued, "That sounds noble. But for people who feel unheard, it can also sound like an excuse." The word excuse hit harder than avoidance ever had. It carried judgment, expectation, a challenge wrapped in reason. Josh didn't flinch. "I know," he said, "and if I were listening from the outside, I might hear it that way too." Sunny leaned in again, her tone sharper now. "So where does that leave the people waiting for voices like yours?" Josh turned toward her slowly. "It leaves them with a truth they may not like." The audience stilled. "That I'm not a spokesperson," he continued. "I'm a participant, and participants don't always lead the march. Sometimes they listen. Sometimes they support quietly. Sometimes they mess up." Joy crossed her arms. "But people see you as a leader whether you ask for it or not." Josh nodded. "I didn't ask for it," he said softly. "But I don't run from it either." There was something different in his voice now, less guarded, more exposed. The calm was still there, but it was threaded with vulnerability. The kind that doesn't beg for sympathy, but doesn't hide either. "When everything erupted," he went on, "I watched colleagues rush to post statements within hours. Some heartfelt, some strategic. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. I almost joined them," Josh admitted. "I had drafts, pages of them." Whoopi's expression shifted, curiosity overtaking challenge. "What stopped you?" Josh swallowed. "The fear that I was about to turn pain into branding." The audience reacted audibly, gasps, murmurs, applause that broke out instinctively before tapering off. Sunny shook her head slightly. "But silence can still feel like branding too." Josh met her eyes. "Only if we assume intent." That line hung heavy. Assumptions. Intent. The space between them where narratives are built without consent. Whoopi leaned forward again, her voice quieter now. "You're asking for grace," she said. Josh nodded. "Yes. And you're willing to give it too?" Josh didn't answer right away. He looked down briefly, then back up. When he spoke, his voice was firm. "I have to be," he said. "Otherwise, this is just ego dressed up as principle." The audience broke into applause again, stronger, more unified. Even Joy nodded slightly, the skepticism easing into something more contemplative. Whoopi let the moment breathe. Then she asked the question no one had said out loud yet. "Did you regret it?" she asked. "Staying quiet when the world was loud?" Josh exhaled slowly. This was it, the emotional center of the storm. "Yes," he said. The room froze. "Yes," he repeated. "I regretted how it was perceived." A few audience members nodded. Others leaned forward. "But I don't regret why I did it," he continued. "Because every time I almost spoke out of pressure, I remembered that the loudest voices aren't always the most sincere." Sunny's expression softened. "But sincerity doesn't always reach people." Josh smiled sadly. "Neither does noise." That landed, not as a victory, but as a truth no one could easily refute. Whoopi leaned back, eyes searching his face. "You know people will clip this," she said. "They'll take 10 seconds and decide who you are." Josh shrugged slightly. "They already have. And that doesn't bother you?" Josh's smile faded. "It does," he admitted. "But being misunderstood is the cost of speaking honestly." The studio was silent now. No murmurs, no applause, just attention. Josh continued, his voice low but steady. "What bothers me more is the idea that we've trained ourselves to demand statements instead of substance, to measure morality by timing instead of action." He glanced at the audience. "That's not justice. That's theater." The word echoed. Theater. On a stage. Under lights. Whoopi nodded slowly. "You're saying we're complicit?" Josh met her gaze. "All of us," he said. "Including me." That admission shifted everything. This wasn't deflection. It was ownership. The audience responded with a wave of applause, respectful, emotional, layered with recognition. Whoopi smiled faintly. "You're making people uncomfortable." Josh smiled back. "I think that means we're close to something real." Laughter broke out, relieved, warm. The tension eased just enough to breathe, but it didn't disappear. Because the conversation had crossed a line. It wasn't about Josh Charles anymore. It was about how culture consumes conscience. How quickly sincerity gets flattened into sound bites. And as the segment drew toward its final moments, the weight of what had been said lingered in the air. The hosts exchanged glances. The audience waited. Because everyone could feel it. The calm, cutting response had done more than defend a choice. It had cracked open a mirror. And in the final moments to come, that mirror would be turned outward, toward the world watching, ready to decide what this moment meant, and whether it would be remembered as restraint or revelation. The show ended the way it always does. Theme music swelling, smiles returning, cameras pulling back, but the room didn't reset with the credits. The audience stood, not in celebration, but in something closer to acknowledgement. They weren't applauding a performance. They were releasing tension they'd been holding for nearly an hour. Josh rose from his chair, shaking hands, exchanging brief words with the hosts. Off mic, off script. Whoopi leaned in and said something only he could hear. He nodded once, respectfully. There was no winner here. No clean resolution. Just two people who had gone somewhere real on live television. And knew it. As Josh walked backstage, the hum began. Phones were already out. Clips were already being cut. 10-second moments ripped from context. Captions racing ahead of nuance. One quote framed as courage. Another framed as arrogance. Headlines forming before the makeup had even been wiped away. Josh Charles slams culture of performative activism. Josh Charles defends silence on The View. Whoopi Goldberg challenges Josh Charles and gets a calm but cutting response. None of them fully true. None of them fully false. Within minutes, social media fractured into familiar camps. Some hailed him as refreshingly honest, a man refusing to commodify morality. Others accused him of intellectualizing privilege, of hiding behind eloquence, while others bore the cost of urgency. Threads exploded. Comment sections burned. Everyone heard what they wanted to hear. And Josh knew they would. Later that night, alone in a quiet hotel room, he watched a clip circulate. The moment he said, "I'd rather fail honestly than succeed performatively." The line was already trending, already detached from the breath that came before it, the hesitation that followed. He didn't smile. He didn't wince either. This was the aftermath he'd accepted. On The View the next day, the hosts addressed it briefly. Whoopi didn't walk it back. She didn't double down. She said something simpler. Sometimes, she told the audience, the most uncomfortable conversations are the ones we needed. That clip traveled too. Opinion pieces followed. Podcasts debated his intent. Think pieces dissected his tone. Some demanded apologies. Others demanded more silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. What was lost in much of the noise was the quiet truth underneath it all. That a man had sat under bright lights and refused to turn conviction into performance, even when it would have been easier. Weeks later, at a small charity event, no cameras, no press, someone thanked him. Not for what he said on television, but for a conversation he'd had years ago, privately, when no one was watching. Josh listened, nodded. That was enough. Because moments like the one on The View don't end when the show cuts to black. They ripple. They force people to choose between noise and nuance, between reaction and reflection, between demanding a statement and doing the work of understanding one. And for everyone who watched, argued, agreed, or walked away angry, one thing remained undeniable. Josh Charles didn't stun the room by shouting. He did it by staying calm, by letting silence carry weight instead of fear. By reminding everyone that sometimes the sharpest response isn't the loudest one, it's the one that refuses to perform. Now it's your turn. What did you hear in that moment? Was it honesty or avoidance? Courage or comfort? Drop your opinion in the comments. I want to read it. And if you want more intense, cinematic, and emotionally charged stories like this, subscribe to Neon Narration, hit like, and share this with someone who loves real conversations that don't flinch when things get uncomfortable. Because the most powerful moments aren't always explosive. Sometimes they're quiet, and they cut the deepest.